on is Indian science competitive? May I request Professor P. Balaram come to the dais, and Professor P. Balaram would be chairing the session. May I also invite the panelists, Mr. S. Arunachalam, Dr. V. Sumantran, Dr. Gangan Pratap, and Sundar Sarukai. He's come. Please come. Before I hand over the mic to Professor P. Balaram, I would like to request that we keep the presentations to 10 minutes and the remarks of the chairpersons maybe to about 10 minutes and the discussion to about 15-20 minutes. We are running a little behind schedule, so kindly cooperate. Thank you.
Because we are a bit late, we'll start without any preliminaries. This is the only session in which the title has a question, and there are three possible answers: yes, no, and maybe. And at the end of this discussion,
Okay. No, it should be okay. Balaram said there are three answers, possible answers to this question: yes, no, and maybe. My answer is no. We are not at all competitive. Let me tell you why I feel so. As Professor Rao pointed out in his presentation this morning, in chemistry, based on chemical abstracts, India's contribution has come down from 3.4% of the world's share about 15 years ago to 2.3 now, 2.3, which is very much lower. And also he said that China has gone to 12, which is also true. So other countries in this region, like South Korea and China, and also other developing countries like Brazil, are moving forward at a very quick pace, and we are not doing. I will give you some data from what's called the Web of Science, which is nothing but the old Science Citation Index on the web, which covers a larger number of journals than before. And I have here India's share of the world contributions in science, classified by 22 different fields. And we contribute the maximum in the area of agricultural sciences, 5.48% of the world's research papers in agricultural sciences, as classified by the Thomson's group of companies, come from India, 5.48%. And its relative impact as compared to the world's average is minus 68. I mean, if the world is 100, India is 32. In all fields, without exception, in all the 22 fields, the impact of Indian research papers as measured by the number of citations divided by number of papers is less than unity in all. We come somewhat close in the case of material science, where we are only short by 31%. It is, if it is 100 for the world, 69 for India. And in physics, we do slightly better. It is minus 24. It is 76% of the world's citations and so on. So between 1999 and 2003, India published 86,440 papers in 5 years. That listed at least one Indian author. Of these, the highest percentage appeared in journals classified as agriculture. And then in physics, for example, papers from India came at 76% of the world's average citations, and so on and so forth. So this is the way we function now, I mean, science in India. And the overall ranking of India for the papers published between March 192 to December 31, 2002, that's the latest I have, not up to 2005, but 2002, a 10-year period, slightly more than 10 years, 10 years and 9 months. India's rank in terms of number of papers published is 21. In terms of number of citations, total number of citations is 13. And in terms of citations per paper, which is more important of the indicators, is 119. So we are nowhere near the top in the world in terms of the impact that our work produced in India has on science as a whole generated in the world. So as all of us know, science is at once a competitive and cooperative activity. All of us want to do science, and then sometimes we want to hold it back for some time so we can achieve something more before we release it. Sometimes we want to gain priority and then we want to release it quickly and so on. In the sense that we need to use work done by others, standing upon the shoulders of giants as they call, it is cooperative. In the sense we want to take patents and keep it to ourselves, it is competitive and so on. But the most important function of science is the production of new knowledge, and the production of new knowledge is based on how well we use the knowledge that already exists. This is what we capture in terms of citations. So literature acts as a mirror for this activity. When you write a paper, you cite so many others. These citations provide links to others. And the links provide not only a method for performance evaluation in terms of publishing, in terms of citation per paper and so on, but also the connectivity between different aspects of science. The intellectual structure can be mapped using these technologies. In fact, there have been outstanding discoveries made purely on citation analysis without going to the laboratory. New drugs have been invented by people who predicted, based on citation analysis, that a possible drug is somewhere hidden here. And then the laboratory scientists took over and so on. There are such examples. So this is a very important aspect of citation analysis. I have a few suggestions for this audience. And it is possible for us to do and to improve the citation performance, to improve our scientific performance and so on. One of the things is, often people question the wisdom of using impact factor, citation analysis, etc., in the context of India. I think it is too defensive to do that. I think if you are really good in your science, you don't have to really bother about the use of these technologies. Even so, if we are not careful, we might make mistakes. Often in India, certain class of people carry out citation analysis without really understanding how science is performed. They have not had an exposure to laboratories or talking to scientists, attending meetings or conferences of scientists and so on. So they mechanically use this data from citation index and come up with some findings which are off the mark by a long way. That is something we should despise. To totally avoid using impact factor citation analysis in performance evaluation will be very deleterious to Indian science. If we really want to be competitive in the world, we may have to use the same yardsticks others use. That is one. Number two, if we really want others to quote our work, the first thing that we should make is for others to see that we have published something. We publish in all kinds of journals, even the best of journals like Nature or Science or PNASE, or Indian journals and so on. Now, many journals are not easily accessible to even the best of libraries because they don't subscribe to all of them. But if you adopt the archiving system, such as a physicist adopted 15 years ago in Los Alamos and now moved to Cornell, then the chances of our papers being seen by the rest of the world is pretty high. Just put a keyword, people will come to know irrespective of where you are. I have been kind of crusading on this aspect for a couple of years now, and the Institute of Science has set up an archive, and I am told that a 10-month period, whatever they had published in that archive, whatever they have put in that archive, were seen by more than 1.5 lakh people, out of which 55 or 65,000 came from USA. People who would otherwise not have seen the papers, they are now seen. I think this open access will improve the visibility to our papers. That is one. Number two is, because there are these incompetent or inefficient researchers who do the citation analysis and come up with outrageous results, we should set up an observatory for science and technology in India. Such an observatory is there all over Europe. One of the earliest was in Paris, the next was in the Netherlands. Now 20 European countries have observatories of their own. And the European communities have their observatory. This observatory can be constantly monitoring what Indians publish, where do they publish, what its consequences for industry, agriculture, or science per se will be, and so on. This proposal I gave in 96, and then, like Professor Rao said, not an undersecretary, but a science-trained director scuttled it. It was all ready. Professor Natarajan of IIT Madras was ready to host it, and he was even ready to fund partially. We asked for some money from DST, and then the DST was, one of the senior officers said that he will come for a discussion, and then on the final day he didn't arrive. When I called them, they wouldn't reply. They scuttled it. So I think it is important to have an observatory for science and technology in India, where competent people who know how to handle these things will monitor, and then we can have a committee of scientists to oversee all that. So this is another important suggestion I want to make. It is often possible to make a dent on science policy in India. It's not as if always you meet dead walls. For instance, about 15 years, long back in the early 70s, I had an opportunity to work at the academy here as in those days it was called secretary and editor of publications. One day I went to Professor Ramaseshan, who was at that time Mr. Academy. He was all in all there. I told him, your academy has a lot of people who ought not to have been there, and there are a lot of people outside who ought to have been there. He was furious. He said, get out of my room. Okay, I said, it's all right. I am telling you for your good. If you don't like it, I am getting out. 3 or 4 days later, he came to my lab, patted me like this and said, Arun, the other day you said something. Why don't you come and talk about it? I said, you find somebody who is amenable to your suggestions. I mean, you said I'm talking too much. You asked me to get out. I'm not coming again. But then we patched up, and then I prepared a list of number of people, and then for 2 years the academy changed its rules. Instead of electing 10, they would elect 100. And then 85 and 85, 170 people were elected at that time in the academy. So one can make a dent. Sometimes it is possible, sometimes it is not. I hope these two ideas, that creating open access archives in all our institutions, as Indian Institute of Science has done, and setting up an observatory for science and technology in India, outside the government, not part of DST or DSIR, outside the government, in an independent body with its own autonomy, would help a great deal. Maybe I'll stop here, and then I can come back during question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you. What we'll do is we'll reserve the questions after all the panelists have made their presentations. So may I request Dr. Sumanta?
Good morning. I just have a few thoughts. Sometimes they say a picture paints 1,000 words, so it makes my job easier to convey what I would like to share with you today. As to the question itself, as to whether Indian science is competitive, maybe that is a question that necessarily involves looking backwards. We have to do it. Fortunately, I was given the pleasant task of looking forward and saying, how can we improve competitiveness, and how can we, if possible, institutionalize competitiveness? So I will restrict my remarks at this point to this subject. I think the first thing is, anytime we talk about competitiveness, we must have a way to measure it. And without getting into semantics, I think the most enduring, most broad, acceptable way of measuring impact of science would be, how does it impact society? At the end of the day, none of what we can do will have any meaning without impact on society. And that impact can be broad. It can be material. It can lead to specific things that we can measure, like life expectancy, ability to communicate, quality of life. In some cases, it might be intangible. Even aesthetic value is something that society would be willing to fund and support. But nevertheless, in all that we do, there must be some way of actually measuring how what we do impacts society. And of course, in this audience, we don't have to talk about everything that we've really got today, in one way or the other, derives from science. The cell phones that you use, our ability to communicate wherever we are. Every one of us probably has a strand of man-made fibers in our clothing and apparel. Even this laser pointer that I'm using is not going to be something that we could have done without fundamental understanding of quantum physics and the quanta of excitation of atomic energy levels. So there is no denying that science has shaped the way we live. But I think the question is, how have we done in India, and how competitive are we, and how successful are we in doing what we want to do to impact society? And even here, there are a number of successes. We've had successes because of an obsession with indigenization, which we look back and say in some respects was really fortunate. We've gained competence and capabilities in a number of very critical areas. But yet, as Professor Rao reminded us this morning, this is not a session to pat ourselves on the back. This is a session to look and say, where could we do better? And I think every one of us will admit, by that measure, we have lost a lot of ground. Indian science and technology has lost a lot of ground over the last few centuries. Whenever I think of pockets of excellence, when I see bright spots of talent in the country, I'm always reminded by these words from Thomas Gray. Full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bare. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen, and waste its sweetness in the desert air. When we travel around India, when we travel to the villages, or indeed even when we travel to institutions, we talk today about oases of excellence. We've talked about pockets of brilliance. But yet, when we take it all together, where is the collective output? We have pockets of success, but where is the grand success for Indian science and technology? And this is the question that we would have to address. And if we're going to institutionalize competitiveness, this is something we must be able to accomplish. And I believe that what this requires is some sort of, to use a scientific phrase, a field. There must be a field that pulls together the pockets of talent and the pockets of creativity. How can we create these fields that will bring alignment to what we want to do and achieve greater purpose for society and for humanity? What are the mechanisms that can create these fields? And how do we, through creating these fields, institutionalize our ability to be competitive? I think everybody will admit that these fields can be created with natural economics. Keynesian economy has been time-tested, and it is one of the most natural ways for aligning people and behaviors. But in many cases, we may have to think ahead. We may have to think beyond what society today will ascribe value. We have to think about things that we in science and technology will become critical enabling technologies of the future. And so there would be need to couple the natural economics of drivers and gravitational fields to create specific missions, strategic missions that we believe in the future will help us. And these fields must be capable of harnessing and linking a whole range of component sciences and technologies. A single mission can lead to 100 different areas and 100 different subjects that would require development. It must span across public and private institutions, and it must be able to take the whole country along with it. And so if we were to look at, has this been done? Well, I think the Silicon Valley has been perhaps the best example one can list for the natural economy and the ability of natural systems to drive creativity. The rate at which technology is being driven, science is being promoted through components, processors, microprocessors, has been dramatic. And people say that Moore's law has really become a self-fulfilling prophecy because the rate at which devices become more powerful, more compact, and less expensive is dramatic. The latest Sony toy that you could buy for your child for Christmas season this year has more computing power than most of the virtual reality systems that many of us used in our science institutions 8 years ago. That is the pace with which costs are coming down and capability is growing because there is a natural field that drives competitiveness. But there are, as I said, many cases where we would have to go beyond. Who would deny that the US mission to say we'll put a man on the moon in a decade did not spawn huge number of scientific inventions, huge amounts of investment in science and technology across a large number of disciplines. And this came from an a priori definition of the objective. We will place a man on the moon in 8 years. And the breadths of technology it covered, ranging from propulsion to control and guidance systems to materials and life preservation systems, caused this mission to reach out to universities, reach out to NASA, reach out to government laboratories, and harness the imagination of an entire people. I remember when I was an 8-year-old in Chennai, the thing that struck us for about 4 months was a mock-up of the lunar module that was plonked right in the middle of Mount Road in the United States Information Service. If this program could stimulate the interest of kids 15,000 miles away from where it was created, can you imagine the power of a mission like this to create interest and motivation for science? And sometimes these missions can be even derived from sinister or aggressive motives. The lesson learned by the US military in the Vietnam War convinced them that any future war they would fight would require no body bags. They concluded that their society was not going to tolerate American soldiers coming back in body bags, and so the defense establishment would have to create those technologies and systems to ensure that future combat could be achieved with no body bags. And that led to a whole range of technologies ranging from cruise missiles, very advanced surveillance and warning systems, and indeed the stealth technology. And I can tell you that there were at least 100 or 1,000 Indian scientists and technologists who were probably involved in one or other of these programs, because they just harnessed the entire base of universities, academic institutions, and research laboratories. And yet, during the first week of the Gulf War, if I remember right, the ratio of casualties between the American side and the Iraqi side was something like 1:1,800. And so, whether it was sinister or not, specific missions with specific objectives harness a whole range of technologies, and they can be brought to bear on a specific objective. Now, I've had the privilege of being a part of a more passive program, if I might call it that, during the time of the Clinton administration and the obsession of the Vice President Al Gore to have environmentally cleaner solutions and environmentally responsible technologies for the United States. The automotive industry came together with the United States government to form a consortium called US CAR, which had participation from industry, government, and academia for a specific program. And this program, in turn, with a very specific objective of tripling the fuel efficiency of passenger vehicles, caused a huge number of programs to be created in composites, in materials, in propulsion systems, in recyclability, in batteries. A whole range of technologies were allowed to bloom, and investments were made across universities and government labs, and with close participation from industry, to make sure that these things could happen. Now, as it often happens in politics, when the Bush administration came into power, this was wiped out. And the PNGP program became anathema to the new Republican administration, and they wanted a new program, which they called the Freedom Car. And President Bush chose to change his focus, and he wanted a specific point of reference, which became the hydrogen economy. Well, what happened? They had to harness the same institutions, they had to harness the same universities, the same academic laboratories, and the same industries. And what did they come up with as priorities? It was practically the same consortia projects. So the scientists and the technologists found a way to make sure that their preserved, identified programs, identified as priority, remain preserved, notwithstanding a political change in the center. Now, how do we institutionalize competitiveness in India? How do we learn from these lessons and make it happen in India? I think our Honorable Minister, Kapil Sibal, this morning alluded to this. We've made successes in several areas. IT is a prominent example of success from India. Why can't pharma and biotech replicate the success of IT in India? We are too large a country to be known for just one industry sector. And pharma and biotech share so many of the characteristics that have helped make IT a success in India. They are subject to competitive market conditions. We would have to make sure that the organizations and the research institutions there continue to be incentivized for investment. We have a very large pool of trained people, and most importantly, competitiveness in this sector does not call for the kind of investment that heavy manufacturing or heavy industries would call for. This is certainly an opportunity for us to say the free market forces, encouraging competition, protecting IP, making the right investments in R&D can stimulate another sector for us in India. And as far as mission modes are concerned, I'm sure you will all agree that there is ample scope in India to come up with a number of critical missions for India. Every time we see pictures of people who have no access to clean water, polluted cities, infant mortality that still languishes way behind developed countries, are these all not opportunities for us to say they can become the basis of mission modes? So why can't we have clean water for every citizen by 2010? Why can't we call for infant mortality levels to be at developed country levels by 2012? Why can't we have the world's best levels of energy efficient economy, demand that the population that we have, the energy consumption that we will have in the country in the future must force us to become world leaders in efficient use of energy? And if we were to set these together, adopt ownership of these goals at the highest levels in the country, make sure that we have mechanisms to ensure that they will sustain across economic cycles and across political cycles, make sure that they harness the entire value chain, identify the critical game-changing technologies and invest in specific R&D to break those deadlocks, and make sure that we're able to fund this with a pragmatic balance between funding risk and rewarding success. I think these missions can become successful. I'll give you a personal example. In our own company, when we took on the challenge of saying, we will develop a people's car for the price of ₹1,00,000, in a sense for us, this was a mission. And this was a mission that had many of the characteristics I just talked about. It had ownership of the mission at the highest level. Mr. Ratan Tata has personally staked his reputation on the ability of the company to put on the road a car capable of transporting a family of 4 at a price of ₹1,00,000. It is viewed not as a project but as an enterprise spanning not just what we would do in the company but what the supply chain would do, what the distributor network would do. It harnesses the entire chain of value adds in the total economy. We've looked at critical game changers. I've had personally discussions with the CEOs of some of the biggest American companies who are fascinated by the subject and who feel that none of the technologies employed in the auto industry globally today would be relevant for this project, and they're willing to break through new ground because what is all right for a vehicle that sells at $15,000 is not all right for a vehicle that sells at $2,000. So new materials would be needed, new powertrain systems would be developed. And with this, we have no doubt had to balance funding multiple solutions, managing risk, but at the same time constantly making sure that our funding was result dependent. And finally, we found that this project has allowed us to go beyond where we were. With the Indica project, our company felt that we were catching up with the West. With this project, we're absolutely sure that we're going ahead of where the state of the art is, only because we've identified a specific objective which none of the world is interested in, which none of the rest of the world is interested in, but which we believe is extremely relevant for India. And sure enough, this effort is garnering a tremendous amount of international acclaim. It is being heralded internationally as a revolution in the making. And while the job is by no means done, and while a lot of work remains ahead of us, the amount of energy that this has unleashed in the human population in our company is something to behold. And this is the power of missions to stimulate and motivate people. So, how do we institutionalize science and technology in India, and how do we institutionalize competitiveness? There is no single prescription. We are too large a country. We have to have dependence on a broad range of skills and technologies, and so we will have to plan for both the natural economy model and for the mission mode. We must engage the interests of as large a population as is possible, and as we've heard several times this morning, we must reinforce education and skill development initiatives. I'm sure this is going to be possible, and I do hope 20 years from now, if we were to sit here and talk about is Indian science and technology competitive, the answer will be a resounding yes. Thank you.
So, a very good morning to Professor Rao, Dr. Kasturi Rangan. I'm not sure why I was chosen for this subject. I'll have to find out. I'll have to find out by the end of the day. When I got the letter from Dr. Kasturi Rangan, I went home and told my wife, I've been asked to talk about creativity. And she said, why on earth did they choose you for that subject? So that probably tells you how little prepared I am on this topic. And she told me read Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, and I did. And Virginia Woolf says that you need 500 pounds and a room of one's own if you have to be creative. And that probably will translate to something like maybe 20,000, 30,000 rupees a month now, and a room of one's own. I had a problem in finding acceptable definition of creativity. I searched, now that you have the internet, I searched everywhere, all the way back to Aristotle, who said that, I'm quoting Aristotle, so please don't quote me as having said that. Aristotle said, women are biologically incapable of creativity. And we have 20 centuries data. Samuel Taylor Coleridge saying that to be creative you must have an androgynous mind. Half your mind must be female and the other half has to be male. And probably it goes back to the Chinese idea of the yin and the yang. So I asked myself this question, is it simply a question of half your mind being one thing and the other half being the opposite? Or is it something more complex than that? And maybe that will explain whether we Indians are creative or not. So I thought I'll take this approach. Can I have the next? I'll use the mouse, yes. So I'll come to a little more abstract argument, but I'll try to build that into the overall definition of creativity. We have a tradition in the philosophy of science that is known as pragmatism, which goes back to an American engineer named Charles Sanders Peirce. He called it abduction. And then, of course, a lot of us are aware of what Popper had to say about falsifiability, which mainly is a rational, critical part of scientific research. That is through the process that most of us see as induction and deduction. And the thesis that I am going to present to you is that creativity requires something that's widely erratic and chaotic. And maybe I'll prove my point by the time I end the lecture. Now, we have Protagoras saying that there are two sides to every question. As I said, Aristotle says you need only the male mind to be creative. And you have Coleridge saying that no, you need a balance of the male and the female. And this dichotomy is present throughout the history of knowledge, of any kind of intellectual activity. So just as you have this dichotomy, I'm trying to pose creativity as opposing what I call, in the Popperian sense, criticality, analyticity, logicality, and so on. I'm trying to say that they're two different things. Now, there is a society that tries to propagate this forgotten philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce. They say that abduction is the process by which we form and select the best in the sense that it's the simplest, the most economical explanation of an observed regularity. In other words, again, you have Descartes saying exactly the opposite, that absolutely certain knowledge is arrived entirely by deduction, much before Peirce. And Peirce says no. Hypothesis formation comes from what he called an abductive act of deception. In other words, you can break it down into 3 steps, the entire process of scientific research, or for that matter, any kind of hypothesizing. It doesn't matter whether it's social science or economic science or hard science like physics or aeronautical engineering. You observe the surprising fact, and that's usually done only in the experimental lab. And if you don't observe that surprising fact, then there is no more science to proceed with. And then you invent this hypothesis A, which is capable of explaining C. And then you come to the last step, and this is the step of criticality, where you use the logic of induction and deduction to establish that there are prima facie grounds for believing in A. I think this almost sounds like a forensic approach that a lawyer would be doing with. And Peirce said, think of what trillions and trillions of hypotheses might be true, but there's only one that will probably solve and find an explanation of the situation. And he says scientists usually are very good at hitting upon this correct hypothesis. Now I'll just go back to my own experience, because I'll probably explain to you why I began to believe that there is this process called abduction. This is the most creative work I've done in my life. What I'm showing now. I mean, it got me the Bhatnagar Prize and it got me elected to the academies, and it's got me 2 papers, one with 100 citations and the other with 50 citations. So I believe on very firm grounds that this is the most creative thing I did in my life. Now, around 1977, there was this controversy known as locking. I think Professor Narasimha would be familiar with this because he was the one who got me elected to the academy. See, if you look at that table, you see something very interesting. You see, this is a surprising fact because the answer should have been 1. The answer to this very simple problem should have been 1, but a computation using what is called a finite element method produces an answer that's 0.0000020. And if you start refining the mesh, it proceeds to 1 at a very, very slow rate. You need millions of elements to solve this problem. Now, what I noticed was that there was an interesting pattern. If you take the 2-element answer, it's exactly 4 times the 4-element answer, or 1-element answer. If you take the 4-element answer, that's 4 times the 2-element answer. Now, that's the process of induction. And then you guess that the next answer should have been 0.00128, and it wasn't. And that surprised me. This is published in literature and this appears in all the books. And I said there must be something wrong. So I told my colleague who was working with me, let's redo the whole thing. I was sure the answer should have been 0.00128. So Bhashyam redid the whole thing, the entire work that Hughes did. And indeed it was 0.00128. And indeed by a process of induction, you see that the next answer is 0.05120. Now there is a surprising fact. There is a pattern. And why should this be so? In fact, these are the patterns summarized as basic statements. Now, what's exciting about science is that what you observe empirically, you must be able to predict independently from first principles. And this is something that's forgotten in our science education in our country. The empirical law is observed. But science becomes complete only when you close that loop. You should be able to derive this from first principles. In other words, can these be predicted a priori? In other words, that law, what I call the phenomenological law or the empirical law, which is observed and derived inductively, can this be derived And to derive this, you need first to state the first principles. And very often these first principles are not known. And that's set up only by the process of abduction. And having set up the first principles, then you can bring in the entire machinery of mathematics and logic and so on. And that's a process of deduction. So I'm breaking the whole process down to 3 steps: abduction, deduction, and induction. Now, prior to what we did, there were a lot of theories published of why you should get such absurd answers. I mean, these are the dozen guesses or a million guesses that Peirce talked about. So they said the rank of the matrix is too high, the spectral condition number is too high, various theories which all try to explain the same thing. And to this we added our contribution, what we call the field consistency paradigm. Now, what is clearly wrong with the earlier hypothesis was that it fell into a trap that Popper called the Neptune Fallacy. And this is very common in the scientific tradition. The fallacy goes like this: why is the sea so rough? Because Neptune is angry. And how do you know Neptune is angry? Why can't you see that the sea is rough? And we always get into this kind of loop all the time. In fact, that's exactly what is happening in my field. Why the answer is so low? Because it's locking. And how do you know it's locking? Why can't you see that the answers are low? And this was a sort of argument that was found in all the textbooks at that time. So we proposed this hypothesis, and then the whole chain of work. And indeed, we could derive it from first principles. You know, I was just reading the other day an article which says that philosophers don't like to use figures. Now you see that Peirce, I spelled wrongly there, it should be P-E-I-R-C-E, not the way the tennis player spells her name. There are 3 steps, as I show. And in the classical logic of Aristotle, all syllogistic argument goes into these 3 steps. That is, you have a rule, you have a case, you have a result. I'll give you examples. And the split hemisphere theory of brain functioning says that you have a left brain and a right brain. I mean, that had gained currency for a long period of time. And it's more or less accepted by most of us today that one side of the brain is very good at analysis, in other words, dealing with theoretical rules, and the other side of the brain is very good at empirical work, the right brain, which is good at synthesis. So the link is like this now. They are all intertwined: deduction, induction, abduction. I think it's not very easy to compartmentalize them. Now, before I proceed further with what Peirce has said, when I saw this, it reminded me of a very interesting lecture that Professor Narasimha had given in this campus, but I was not here, but I could read it on the internet, which was titled "The Second Half of the Needham Question: Why India Did Not Make That Great Leap into Science in the 15th Century." And he was comparing Indian scientific tradition with the Greek tradition. And he said Indians are very good at algorithms, but not good at model making. You can correct me, sir, if I'm wrong, but I'm probably coming to the same thing. So what he meant in my terms is that Indians are very good at deduction and maybe reasonably good at induction. And that's the reason why we make very good computer programmers. But we just are not good at making those abductive leaps that create these grand theories and so on. And that is one reason why when Basham wrote his book about the history of India, he said the wonder that was India in the past tense. And he wrote 2 great things came out of India: Buddhism and the number 0. So maybe that's the place from which we'll have to start. The next. So deduction is very simply this in terms of syllogistic argument. From the rule and the case, you get the result. So you have the formula and you write the code. And we Indians are very good at that. And so we are employed in very large numbers. 1/3 of the software engineers that the world is producing today come from India. We are 16% of the world's population, but we produce 1/3 of the world's software engineers. We are 16% of the world's population, but we produce only 2% of the world's scientific literature. And only 0.5% of the world's highly cited science. I'm sure Arunachalam will agree with me. Now, there is a belief that the IT sector is doing much better than the scientific sector, and that's not true. If you look at the parallels with the IT sector, again you'll find that in the IT service sector, we contribute 2% of the world's IT services. But if you take the IT product sector, we contribute only 0.5% of the world's products. So our scientific sector is doing as well as the IT sector. But we are not as celebrated as the IT sector is. I'm talking in terms of proportions and numbers. So our scientific world is actually doing reasonably well. We are 2% of the world's GDP. We contribute 2% of the world's scientific literature. So we are punching at our weight level. So unless we pump much more money into the scientific world, we would not do better than that. Anyway, this explains to us clearly why we Indians are very good at IT. Because we are now trapped in this area of brain activity, deduction. Not so much in induction, that is, from the case and the result, get the empirical rule. See, here I make a difference between empirical science and theoretical science. From the case and the result, make the rule. But if you want science to be holistically connected, you have to make a deductive rule. That is, when you know the result and the rule, you know what the case is. This is what is missing in our culture. We are not trained to do that. In fact, this is the most famous argument that's used from Aristotle. It's the same thing again. Deduction is this, induction is this, and abduction is that. Now, very recently, studies on the brain have gone beyond the split hemisphere theory. And Gazzaniga says that apart from the right and the left hemisphere, there is a part of the brain called the interpreter. These are done with MRI and PET, and they actually can image these activities when the brain is doing this. And they say that there is a part of the brain, I think they say it's the front part of the left hemisphere, that actually generates hypotheses about cause and effect, even in the absence of evidence. Now, I remember reading Karl Popper, and he said that the beginning of all science was gossip. And the reason why language, the faculty of language, evolved to such an extent in the human brain was because of the human capacity to gossip. That is, to create hypotheses even in the absence of evidence. And now, after so many thousand years, we have scientific evidence for that. And science is only the process of eliminating those gossipy parts that are wrong, are clearly wrong, by a process of weeding out through induction and deduction. So, creativity and innovation are not traditional scientific activities, and this is what we'll have to understand. The routine S&T can be carried out in a bureaucratic environment where you stress structure, order, discipline, where undersecretaries tell you what can be done and what can't be done. But you need unconventional individuals, crucial to innovation. You need the Marconis and the Edisons. And I was telling Professor Balaram that we saw Marconi but not J.C. Bose.
You know, I feel bad about that.
Yeah, I was telling Professor Balaram that you see Marconi but not J.C. Bose. And that more or less sums up what went wrong with Indian science. Because Bose had his own ideas about patenting and IPR. Yeah, he was cheated out of the Nobel Prize, you're right, yes sir. As I said, the creative product is a result of imagination, which is logical, and abstracted thinking, which is logical. And only people who can merge imagination with abstractive thinking can produce a creative product. And somehow we Indians have lost that emphasis on abductive inference. So again, the truth is it two sides of a tossing coin? Are these those 3 points on a spinning wheel? Abduction, deduction, and induction. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kasturi Rangan, for allowing me to come and talk.